So I'd like to introduce Marianne Tawa, who is from the Dana-Farber Cancer Institute up in Boston, and she works very closely with one of those multidisciplinary research facilities in cutaneous lymphoma. So it's really delightful to have Marianne with us. She's going to talk about clinical trials, and I will say that we just started doing research grants last year, and one of our first research grant recipients was at the Dana-Farber. They're doing some research in radiation therapy for cutaneous lymphoma. So it's a pleasure and a delight, as always, to have Marianne with us. And both Dr. Pinter-Brown and Marianne, actually all of our speakers today, are part of our board of directors. So we're really fortunate and very grateful to the time that they give us to help us, navigate the clinical arena. So with that, I'll turn it over to Marianne.
Okay. Thank you, Susan, for the introduction. Can you guys hear me? Usually projection's not an issue, and coming from a big Irish family, across the table one can hear each other. But at any rate, thank you for being here today. This is a really important disease. It's considered to be an orphan disease, a rare disease. So to see this healthy group of individuals together is really great. So it looks like there's some interest in clinical trials. And as Susan mentioned, over on the table for this region, she has some of them outlined. I'm going to talk a bit from the patient perspective, what you need to think about when you're considering a clinical trial. So I have a couple slides that Dr. Pinter-Brown shared with me that sort of mention what's out there in the landscape right now for clinical trials. But I think as patients, when you get a diagnosis, and for many of you, the diagnosis you have of early stage disease is where you're going to be and where you're going to leave the planet with early stage disease. But for other patients with more aggressive disease or disease that isn't responding to traditional therapy, accepted therapy, clinical trials might be a conversation they're going to have in the context of their practice. So as a patient, you really need to know, what is a clinical trial? When do I need to consider it? What are the risks? What are the benefits? How am I protected throughout a clinical trial? So I'm going to talk about that as a patient advocate here, because that's my job as a nurse practitioner, is to take care of my patients largely from a safety perspective, an educational perspective, so they make good decisions for themselves. So that's who I am, and this is where I practice. As Dr. Pinter-Brown mentioned, I work with Dr. Kupper, who's the tall guy back here, and he's a dermatologist, and he is our disease center leader. He is primarily in the lab, worrying about and taking care of T-cell lymphomas, looking a lot at blood involvement in cutaneous T-cell lymphoma. So some of the folks that populate the slides are the research folks that come to our clinic and do behind the scenes in the lab as well. So when you think about clinical trials, well, a number of our patients consent to a study when they join our practice, when they become our patients. And it may not be because they're going to enroll in a clinical trial per se to be tested with a drug, but they're offering their skin or their blood for Dr. Kupper to do some of his basic research. So when you hear about research being done, it's not always to get new drugs in the pipeline or to compare one agent versus something new that's being studied, but it may be to learn more basically about the disease. And we'll talk about, as we move along, what is translational science. So when you come to a disease center that is multidisciplinary, oftentimes there's a lot of these behind-the-scenes folks that are very interested in your disease, but not necessarily to bring a drug in this era, maybe generations to come, but to understand the disease better. So in addition to Dr. Kupper, who does a lot of research on the disease and sees our patients with us, we have an oncologist. So we're multidisciplinary, so we have an oncologist. So as Dr. Pinter-Brown is an oncologist, so as patients make their way through the disease, when we're looking at patients with later stage disease that are candidates for systemic treatments, for infusion therapies, our oncologist gets involved. Or if we have a stubborn case of even earlier stage disease, he may get involved. The guy who's sort of kneeling here, that you look like you think he's the disease center leader, but he's not. He's our radiation oncologist. And as Susan mentioned, we have a radiation study ongoing in our center that is being nicely funded by a research grant through the foundation. And then there are the folks, the program nurse who does a lot of the work with me on the clinical trials, and fellows, and other interested parties. So we're a busy center that takes care of lots of patients with this disease every day of the week. So a little bit about, when you get engaged in a clinical trial, there's going to be a clinical research nurse involved. I'm a nurse practitioner. I tend to do a lot of the work sort of looking at the landscape, taking a look at patients, and sort of sizing up whether or not they're candidates for a clinical trial so that we don't go down that road if they're not an appropriate candidate. Perhaps, and we'll talk about this when we talk about eligibility, perhaps they have an illness that would preclude their ever getting into a clinical trial. They have a history of hepatitis C. Many of the immune therapies would not let a patient with hepatitis C, for their safety and protection, be involved in a clinical trial. So as I consider that my job to really be thinking about that patient and the safety associated with, and whether or not they'd actually be a candidate for a clinical trial. So the clinical, research nurse sort of works in collaboration with a physician, and sometimes it's at ground zero, sort of thing, coming up with a good idea. What would be, an interesting clinical trial? Coming up with maybe a site-initiated trial. We have a number of patients with this variant of disease who have been exposed to this therapy. We're wondering if adding a second drug makes sense, and it's never been done. So maybe it's coming up with an idea like that. And there might be another center that's also interested in sharing that clinical trial. Obviously, to be involved in clinical trials, you need to know about the cancer. So we're talking about cutaneous T-cell lymphoma here, or cutaneous B-cell lymphomas. So we're talking about rare lymphomas. Well, you need to understand the language and the immunology of that cancer in order to sort of size up whether or not the clinical trial experience makes sense for the patients. And then using evidence-based practice. And really, sort of thinking about that patient throughout the context of the trial, not just as this is, a number. This is a patient who's populating my clinical trial, so it's great. It's, increasing the credibility of my trial. But, really, am I really taking care of this patient while they're on the trial? Is there sort of their psychological response to being on a trial, the stress involved, the geographics of traveling for clinical trial visits too much for that patient? So sort of taking that all into consideration as we meet patients and take care of them throughout the course of a trial. This is a really busy slide, and I'm not going to speak to everything, but there's so much involved for the nurses and the nurse practitioners that take care of patients on clinical trials, but it's also lots of others that get involved, the clinical research assistants, and obviously the physicians, or who are referred to as the PIs on the trial. So, administratively, we would look at sort of developing the protocol for the trial, going through what's called the IRB, and that's the Internal Review Board, and that's like the super ego of clinical trials. That's the group that's really making sure that we're keeping patients safe, that our trial makes sense for the population that we're designed to serve, that, it's really been scientifically well thought out. That we have money, that we figure out that we have the money to do the trial. You don't want to start a trial that you're not going to be able to complete or be able to assist your patients through. And then whether or not other national and international cooperative groups are also interested or involved in this trial. There's a lot involved with educating the patient, the family. What's involved here? What's expected of you in the clinical trial? What are we going to impose on you, and what are you going to bring to us? And then taking care of the others who are involved in the clinical trial. So perhaps you're getting an infusion therapy with your clinical trial. Well, the nurses that are infusing this new drug need to understand this new drug. So it becomes your responsibility to do the in-service and the education to that group of nurses so that they too indeed know what this patient's being exposed to, side effect profile, what to report and when. And as I mentioned, I think, as I hear about new agents getting trialed, and as folks come into our office and say, we have this really interesting trial, we'd love for the Dana-Farber to be involved, well, it's sort of our job as we're caring for, the numbers of patients that we do, that we really kind of look along the way and figure out, is this a good matchup? Is this trial that we're thinking about opening, does this make sense for this particular patient? You don't want to expose everybody for the sake of exposing that person to a trial to increase your numbers, but really, does this drug make sense for this patient based on where their disease is at, how many treatments they've tried and failed, and what do they have for options out there? you don't want to necessarily embark on a clinical trial if you haven't tried what's considered standard of care, and we'll talk about that in a minute. And then obviously, you know, what comes of clinical trials oftentimes is sort of the post-trial, preparing manuscripts, writing about your experience with this agent in the clinical trial. So clinical trials and cutaneous T-cell lymphoma, you know, where does nursing fit in? And this is something that I usually share with patients, that they need to think about this. If you're followed in a community dermatology practice where you've been cared for by the same dermatologist or oncologist or both, or a nurse, or you're in a big teaching center like here in Florida, maybe like in Moffitt, and you've had sort of a relationship going and you really feel cared for, and then a clinical trial seems to make sense for where your disease is at, where you're at, what's available to you. You need to sort of be take into consideration, am I going to be removed from this particular clinical setting that's really worked well for me? I have a relationship, I have a language that I speak with my clinicians, and I'm going to move off into a clinical trial arena where I'm going to either geographically be cared for separately, a different set of language might be used because they're going to be having me fill out diaries or sort of refer to my disease in a different way. And who's going to know my history once I go to this new center or this new place? You know, somebody asked about relocating, one of the members of the audience, relocating for clinical trials. Well, you realize that history that you established elsewhere may potentially get lost. It may very well be worth that investment for it to be lost because you're moving into something that perhaps can provide you a better result. But it's something that you need to think about as a patient. And as I mentioned earlier, you know, when patients consent to research, it's not always a clinical trial to investigate a new agent out there for treatment of cutaneous T-cell lymphoma and how safe it's going to be, durability, how long is it going to last, or how effective it's going to be, but it might be providing information for science. So this is, you know, in a lot of the larger teaching centers that are considered to be multidisciplinary, you might be offering tissue. So a lot of our patients, when they first meet us, whether they have stage 1A disease or they have stage 4B disease, we will oftentimes ask if they want to provide us with extra tissue, meaning a skin biopsy, or blood. And then, you know, work gets done with that. Maybe eventually, you know, generations from now, it will sort of bring us a much healthier understanding of what causes this disease, how this disease behaves over time. Maybe we can make predictions of who will respond to what therapy and why if we have tissue and blood. And that's what Dr. Kupper's been doing a lot of work with our Sézary patients, is making predictions who's going to respond to certain therapies. And that's the translational piece. But also we may find out that certain drugs are going to work better, and that's really, really important information. And that sort of all comes together with what's called translational research. And we're seeing more, am I making that noise? No, okay. That's translational research. So what are clinical trials? Sort of the basic question. So it's patient-based research. So we're the patients. To address unsolved problems, a clinical question. The important thing that you need to understand about clinical trials is you don't practice in a vacuum. You're not hidden in a corner somewhere. They're extremely highly supervised and monitored. And the clinical research assistants that are involved with really maintaining the patient records, making sure that bloods are drawn when they're supposed to be drawn at this precise time of day so you get peak levels or trough levels of blood, or that a CAT scan that was needed to be ordered and evaluated within X number of days after being exposed to a drug. Those sort of things are highly monitored by an outside agency, whether it be the sponsor, which might be a pharmaceutical company or a regulatory agency. So they're really looked at from a very, very detailed perspective. And throughout, there's scientific standards, there's ethical standards, and there are clinical standards. We need to make sure we're taking good clinical care of our patients. And we'll talk about some of those questions that patients have as they move along in a clinical trial. What if I'm not responding? What if I'm not doing well? What do I do? And then there are different phases of clinical trials. And I would say that phase 1 trials, most often, you're not going to hear about with patients with cutaneous T-cell lymphomas. It is rare that you'll see a patient with cutaneous T-cell lymphoma get exposed to a phase 1 trial. So what is that? That's first in man. So first time this drug's man has ever been exposed to this drug. And we're looking at sort of how does the drug get metabolized? What dose range are we going to, help somebody or hurt somebody? So it's very, very early phase. Rarely are you going to see that in cutaneous T-cell lymphoma trials. More often, you're going to see phase 2, and most often, you're going to see phase 3 trials in cutaneous T-cell lymphoma. So larger numbers of patients. So you might see a center here in Florida, a center, at Stanford, MD Anderson, Dana-Farber, somewhere in the Midwest. Many centers being involved in this one trial. So when you wonder, gee, clinical trials, do I have to go to the West Coast? Well, it's rare that you would have to do that. You might find something closer to your area. Phase 3 being the most common that you're going to see for our disease. And that's when we're really looking at effect on survival. And that's when you're looking at that drug usually compared to what's considered standard of care. So as Dr. Pinter-Brown mentioned earlier, when you looked on the left side of our slide with all the systemic treatments that are FDA approved for this disease, vorinostat, the HDAC inhibitors like romidepsin, pralatrexate, standard chemotherapies, that's the arm that usually these clinical trial agents, bexarotene, which is an oral agent, a retinoid or vitamin A-derived drug, those are going to be the standard agents that these clinical trial agents are going to be compared against. And they're looking for FDA approval. So this is the step before the federal government approves this agent in this disease and under what terms. And then phase 4 you might be involved in, and that's sort of the post-marketing after the drug's already been approved, collecting more information about this drug, sort of populations of patients over time that have been exposed to this drug. So sort of beyond the job description, what are the realities of practice as folks embark on clinical trial? So, what we need to be assured of as clinicians caring for patients with this disease is that, that this trial, when folks come to your center and say, we have this agent, we have this new molecule, would love for you to think about trialing it. Not that they're coming to me specifically, believe me, I'm not the bottom line here, but when they come to, the physicians in my group or some of the researchers in our group, we really need to make sure ethically for our patients that we've really paid attention to, is there an important scientific question here? And is it potentially going to affect care for our patients? And can we protect and should we protect our patients, obviously, while on this clinical trial? So how do we protect patients? Well, I feel that we protect patients by imparting education so that they understand sort of the, clinical trials. So when a clinical trial gets talked about in the office, I always want patients to think about eligibility. So there are folks that are sitting in this room that have 1A disease. That means less than 10% of their surface area of their skin might be patches or plaques. And then there are patients in this room that might have Sézary syndrome. Or there might be patients in this room that have tumors or have had tumors. So you really need to figure out whether or not you fit into the group. The trial is intended for patients with 1B or greater disease. Or this trial is intended for late-stage disease, for patients with blood involvement. So when clinical trials are being talked about, you really need to figure out, do I fit into this group at all? Is this a study that is even, sometimes studies get presented to patients and they don't really, the benefit isn't really going to be there. So you need to really figure out whether or not you fit into the group to be studied. Do I meet the study requirements? My 95-year-old father, would he have been able to fit into a clinical trial? No, based on his age, he wouldn't. Children, we don't see children in clinical trials. So, that might very well be an issue. Do I have comorbidities? And I find this to be an area where a lot of my patients get excluded from trials. They have a history of another immune-mediated disease that would sort of interfere with the data that's being collected for that clinical trial. So, as I mentioned, hepatitis C oftentimes, or thyroid disease might render somebody ineligible for a clinical trial. And, I always tell everybody to ask that question of themselves is, does the risk of the trial, so what is described as being the side effect profile to this agent or series of agents, or the risk of not knowing which drug I'm going to be randomized to. Most often in clinical trials in cutaneous T-cell lymphoma, there's not a placebo on the other arm. There's not a sugar pill. There is the study drug, and then the other arm is usually what's considered standard of care. So as I mentioned, something that's already been FDA approved for this disease, oftentimes drugs like bexarotene or vorinostat, drugs that have been in the pipeline for a while, tried and true, might be what you would get randomized to, or you might be randomized to what is that considered to be the study drug, the drug that we want to learn more about. So that's a risk for some, to say, gee, I don't want to go to standard of care, or I'd like to be in the standard of care. I don't want to be in the new drug group. So you have to think about that. And what are the benefits to me as a patient and to my family and caregivers? And, what we ultimately learn is this new therapy superior to what's already out there? The slide that Dr. Pinter-Brown showed you is kind of a nice slide for this disease, because 10 years ago, that slide was half populated. So there wasn't a lot on that chart. And the fact that there's a lot on that chart now is very promising for this disease. So safety monitoring, obviously in a clinical trial, we're interested in finding out what are the side effects, because that's the first question that my patients ask me with any drug I talk about with them is, what are the side effects? So we want to learn that early on in clinical trials. And, the concern is that in many of the trials for drugs that are new to the pipeline, we don't know what the side effects are. The patients are expected to experience them and report them to us. And for some patients, that's just not something they can live with. So you have to think about that as a patient. The last thing on that slide was physical exams, labs, and imaging is more frequent. And I just wanted to highlight that. In a clinical trial, you're going to be looked at much more closely than you've probably ever been looked at. So more visits with clinicians. Some of my patients love that. They love to come and see you. For other patients, they don't want to come into the office as much, or it's difficult. Their work life, their home life, the geographics for getting to the clinical trial center is hard. Having more frequent blood tests. A lot of patients, don't like to have their blood drawn. So in clinical trials, they want to look at your blood for a variety of reasons. And more x-rays, so more exposure to either CAT scans or PET scans, because that's the way they follow a lot of patients with clinical trials, is with the imaging studies. And for some patients that causes a lot of anxiety to have a PET scan. What if something shows up on this PET scan that wasn't there, at the last imaging I had 2 months ago? So you need to think about that as you enroll in clinical trials. So when you're in the office and you're talking about clinical trials with your provider, the provider's job is to sort of describe for you and define for you what phase of clinical trial they're talking about for you, so that they need to be able to describe phase 1, phase 2, phase 3. Once again, it's usually 2 or 3 in this disease. Their job is to provide informed consent. So they need to talk to you about the risks and the benefits, what's in it for you, what's in it for them. All that, you need to know what you're agreeing to. And it's usually a 2 or 3 page form that's written in layman's terms so that you know what you're getting into. And that's their job, is to make sure that you are informed on the risks and the benefits of a clinical trial. And then sort of the power of the trial. They need to sort of describe to you how many patients they potentially are going to enroll from their center, how many patients across the United States, how many patients worldwide. So kind of what size group you may or may not be sort of involved in the trial with. And then on the other hand, as the patient, these are the things you're kind of thinking about as your provider is discussing the left-hand side of the slide. Your job is to be thinking about, okay, what if I fall into, and as I mentioned, most often there's not a placebo arm. There's not a sugar pill side for clinical trials in cutaneous T-cell lymphoma. But you wonder, gee, if I get this study drug that I've read about, it sounds really interesting. It seems like it's almost tailor-made for my disease because I express this protein on my lymphoma cells, so it seems like it's almost, tailor-made for me. I really want to get this drug. Versus what's considered standard of care. And sometimes my patients are in the dilemma where the standard of care arm might be 2 drugs, and they've already had one of them, and it worked for a while, and then it stopped working, but they haven't had the other drug, and they may get randomized to that other drug. So for them, that might be a disappointment. For them, it might be okay. And then there's always that question that you need to be asking yourself is, will this new therapy be less effective than what's already out there for me? Have I already exhausted resources? And what happens when the risks outweigh the benefits, so that, the risks involved with side effect profiles, et cetera. And, patients in clinical trials will oftentimes wonder, how's everybody else doing? So they've been in this trial for 6 months, 8 months, and they'll be asking, how the rest of the patients in this trial doing? I don't seem to be, really responding, or I'm responding really well. Is everybody else? Once again, understanding that many of the patients in the trials are designed for patients for 1B through stage maybe 4 disease. So you might be in with a whole group of patients whose disease looks like and behaves quite different from you. But patients are going to have that question. As a patient, you should be asked, am I going to be coming in here more frequently or less frequently, and am I comfortable with that? So are the visits going to be changed? And then sort of, with Obamacare and, you can't turn on CNN this morning without seeing everybody going crazy over this, but insurance reimbursement. Does my insurance company get involved with the clinical trial? Some of the bloods, some of the imaging studies might be covered by your insurance because they'd be considered standard of care for your disease state. Other times they're assumed by the cost of the company that's sponsoring the trial because they're requesting them at certain intervals when you would not normally need to be imaged. So it really varies. So insurance gets involved to some degree, but not totally. So finances, for the most part, should not be a huge concern for patients when looking into clinical trials. Decision making, when you're in an office, when you're in a center, when you've sought out a clinical trial, it makes sense for you, bring somebody else with you. Because what we know about learning and what we know about physicians' offices and so forth, probably 10% of what you hear is going down in the office, and then 90% gets lost. So somebody else there to sort of take notes, write down the study team's answers, and ask questions. So, always bring somebody else if you can. Find out what the study involves, all the logistics, and what other options are available. So, that's the time to explore. Okay, I'm here to talk about the clinical trial, but just want to make sure, have I really explored all other options? You need to understand what's involved. For some patients, the photography is, a no-win game for them because as Dr. Pinter-Brown was talking about, and one of the patients asked a question about, the look of the disease, or what does the patient look like when you're on the phone with the dermatopathologist talking about, I'm giving this patient a cutaneous T-cell lymphoma diagnosis. I want to make sure we've really nailed it, both under the microscope as well clinically. Well, photography is a way in a very visual world, dermatology, skin, this disease loves to live in the skin. That's how we measure response to therapy. In addition to doing those MSWAT scores where you measure the amount of surface area, we need to look at patients. For a lot of patients, having photography done doesn't work for them. They don't want to have pictures taken, so you have to think about that. Sometimes more frequent skin biopsies. I have patients that just really, skin biopsies are not their thing. I mean, well, who would like a skin biopsy? But you might very well have more frequent skin biopsies in the course of a clinical trial, so you have to think about that. More frequent imaging, as I mentioned, CAT scans or PET scans. Who else can you talk to? So, you have to, realize study teams when you're going to a center and they do clinical trials, and it's part of their mission, whether it be for translational research versus drugs in the pipeline or both, hopefully a combination of both. You want to also get opinions from other people in your world that care for you. So your primary care provider, obviously if you're followed by your dermatologist and they have the trial in their center, but you also see an oncologist, well, you might want to get the oncologist's opinion on that. And then going to other places. One of the patients asked, where can I find out about clinical trials? And Dr. Pinter-Brown mentioned the NCI, or the National Cancer Institute. But also you could go to the foundation. The foundation is a great place to help vet out information on clinical trials. And then obviously, hospital libraries have information on clinical trials. American Cancer Society, Lymphoma Research Foundation, foundations in general make it their business to make patients aware of opportunities with clinical trials. Some patients need some financial counseling as they're thinking about trials because it's not just the logistics of, okay, I'm here, I'm getting more frequent blood tests, more frequent imaging, more frequent skin biopsies, more frequent visits, but I'm also driving, 100 miles, or I'm getting on a plane to participate in a clinical trial. So financial counseling is oftentimes involved with enrollment in a clinical trial. And, as a patient, you have to sort of figure out, okay, I have a chronic disease. It's, for the most part, really considered a lifelong disease. So my provider is suggesting that I need to think about a clinical trial. So in the context of a lifelong disease, and I've been exposed to a certain number of therapies, but I know that there are all these others out there that are FDA approved that perhaps I haven't tried. You need to think about, where this trial fits in. Is this a skin-directed trial? So is this, Nitrogen mustard was FDA approved last November, so a year ago. We've been using nitrogen mustard, well, since I was a long time, since I first started taking care of cutaneous T-cell lymphoma patients. We were using it. It was not FDA approved, but we knew it worked in this disease, but it got FDA approval. So now there's a trial that, will be opening shortly, which is another skin-directed trial using a topical HDAC. So like that agent that Dr. Pinter-Brown showed on the left-hand slide, which was romidepsin or vorinostat, well, there's a topical form of that. So you need to sort of figure out, okay, am I looking at a trial that is skin-directed because that's where my disease is residing? I don't have it in my blood. I don't have it in my lymph nodes. I don't have tumors. So why would I want to be exposed to this clinical trial if it's an infusion treatment? You need to ask those questions. What's the benefit for me? What's in it for me versus perhaps a skin-directed therapy? Do prior treatments or successes and failures have predictive value for what this trial agent is? So I usually ask patients, to think about this drug works by this mechanism. And you need to understand, it's not, is it an antibody? Is it an antibody plus a toxin? Is it a traditional chemotherapy? Is it a gene-related therapy? You need to sort of understand what it is. And have I ever been exposed to any drug like this in my care? And if I did well with it and it worked for me, does that predict that maybe I'll do well with this clinical trial agent? So to be thinking about whether or not, once again, do I fit into this group of patients that may have a good possibility of responding? As Dr. Pinter-Brown mentioned, probably, when you look at the systemic side of the slide, the infusion therapies, the therapies that go to the inside to address the disease from the blood and the lymph nodes, or people with big skin burdens like tumors, many of the treatments have a 40% success rate, and that's what you're kind of signing up for. So you might very well be in that 40% that's going to do well, but is there something about my disease, my profile, what I might have been exposed to in the past for treatments that might predict that I'll do well with this study drug? A question to ask. And is a clinical trial intended to postpone or prevent more aggressive systemic treatment? So you need to figure out with the person who's having the conversation with you, particularly when you're looking at systemic agents that are going to go on the inside, am I doing this clinical trial so I don't have to get conventional single-agent chemotherapy? Because what we know about conventional single-agent chemotherapy, like gemcitabine or Doxil, is many of those agents work quite, as she mentioned, Dr. Brown, they work quickly, and they can work very well for many of our patients, but they're not durable. So they might last 5 or 6 months. Then what do you do? So where does a clinical trial fit in? If I've gotten 3 agents, now it makes sense. Or, do this because I'm not a candidate for maybe, the definitive treatment, which for some patients is having a bone marrow transplant. We didn't even talk about that this morning, but for some patients that is going to be their goal. Where does a clinical trial fit in? So these are all questions that I think you have to ask yourself and challenge your clinician with. And then, the provision of care, as I mentioned this and alluded to this earlier, will the team of providers that I've become accustomed to, that know my disease, that have seen me over time, that have seen my other therapies through, are they still going to be involved in my my care and my surveillance while I'm on the clinical trial? And oftentimes the answer to that question is no, they're not, because I've moved to another center, or I've stayed within the same hospital, but to a clinical trial center. And you have to understand and think for yourself whether or not that's okay. And will the usual measures and parameters for how we talk about cutaneous T-cell lymphoma, is some of that going to go away as I move into the clinical trial, new language, So for many of my patients, they have diaries. A lot of quality of life information is gathered from clinical trials. And for them, that's a whole new language. And I spend a lot of time in my practice talking about itch, because it's a big issue in this disease. And it may or may not be something that they're measuring on this clinical trial, and that language may go away. So patients have to think about that. And then success or not. So I'm in this clinical trial. okay, it's working for me, so this is great. I'm on an agent that finally has really, hit the lovely chord here. And what happens when the clinical trial closes? So they've got all the patients that they wanted for enrollment. They've met their N number, so they've got their number of patients. And the drug's, on its way nicely for FDA approval. And we're going to hear from Michael and Brace later about the pharma industry and all that. But it's on its way, and I'm on this drug, and gee, I don't want somebody to take it away from me. Most trials, I'd say in my experience, every trial I've worked with, they don't take that drug away. So if you have proven to be a responder, you have gone into a nice remission, partial remission, or complete remission, usually that drug is available to you on what's considered a compassionate basis. So you stay on that drug while it moves to the FDA approval process. And then what happens when you withdraw? And for a variety of reasons, patients withdraw from trials. It may be side effect profile was too tough. The requirements of the trial were too cumbersome for them. The disease progressed while they were on the clinical trial, and it was felt in their judgment, in their provider's judgment, in the studies team's judgment, it was not serving them well. They come off the trial. So for a variety of reasons, patients might come off trial. And yet, usually you go back, obviously to your clinical provider, or if you stayed with them to begin with, you continue with them. It doesn't mean that you cannot have access to another clinical trial if you meet the profile. So one clinical trial does not necessarily preclude, unless you got an agent that perhaps was going to be later on was going to be the standard of care arm. You already got that drug, so you couldn't get randomized to it. But it doesn't usually work out that way. The other things you need to think about are the logistics, the geographic challenges with being in a clinical trial. Do I need to relocate? Do I need to move out of state? Do I need to get in the car and drive, or do I have to get on a plane? The comfort level, you as a person and your family, to get something that the risks and benefits may not be known, because that's what we're learning by the clinical trial. And do I want to be part of that? And then the side effects that might be new to you, side effects that you didn't have with any other agent that perhaps you've been exposed to. And how are people going to help you manage the side effects? What is acceptable for treatment of side effects while on a clinical trial? Sometimes prednisone. So prednisone is a common oral steroid agent that many of you have probably been on or off through the years for management of your itch, or perhaps if you have involvement beyond the skin compartment. And many of the trials don't let you have prednisone. So if you have an escalation in your itch symptom, prednisone might not be able to be provided for you. Think about employment concerns for patients involved in trials. Can I take time off from work? Do they have visits late in the afternoon? Do they have visits in the morning? How is that going to work with my employer? The costs, once again, most often I do not discourage patients from pursuing a trial for financial reasons. There's a lot usually built into the infrastructure of these trials to help patients with costs. But the personal costs, that's what you have to think about. Your life, your family life, and then sort of who's out there to support you while you're involved in a clinical trial, because it's going to feel different from the day-to-day care that you've been receiving in the course of your disease. And then I just had a couple slides that Dr. Brown shared with me of trials that are out there now. One is this agent called brentuximab, which is SGN-35. We're involved in that clinical trial. And that's sort of, you remember when we were looking earlier at her slides with the different antibodies. And, this is where patients, if they have the CD30 protein expressed on their T cells, this is where we think about, sort of tailor-made treatments that are really boutique for your disease and specifically your proteins on your lymphoma cells. This is a study that looks at a drug that binds to this antibody and then infuses a toxin into the lymphoma cells, so we don't get a lot of the side effects that you see with traditional cell-killing chemotherapies. So that's a trial that's available. If you went to the websites for the NCI, et cetera, you would see this available at many of the larger treatment centers. And then another trial, K10761, which seems to be extremely promising for patients with Sézary syndrome. And then just these are drugs that are, we're involved in the PD-1 program death antibody. Once again, these are drugs that you're going to be seeing out there in the pipeline, studies going on in a lot of the large treatment centers, and will certainly translate to new therapies, hopefully within the next couple years, populating that left-hand portion of the treatment slide. And then, once again, where do I get my information? The foundation, of course, is a great place, but the NCI, the American Cancer Society, the Library of Medicine, and then, of course, our foundations that really help sort of, fine-tune that information and bring it down. Because, as Dr. Pinter-Brown mentioned, the NCI site can be a little daunting. You can plug in, I have mycosis fungoides, and all these studies come up. Well, once again, it doesn't answer all the questions we just talked about. Do I fit into the study group, the variant of the disease, the stage of the disease? And I think the foundation does a really good job with sort of tailoring it to our patient population and their needs. And that is that. Does anybody have any questions?
If a patient is of childbearing age, 20, 30 years old, and they're still trying to build their family, is that usually an exclusion to these trials?
So the question about women of childbearing potential, not necessarily, because for that patient with their stage of disease, what therapies have been exposed to or not exposed to, many of the therapies for this disease are contraindicated in pregnancy. So for many of the patients, they're expected to be on 2 forms of contraception, and that would be the same for a clinical trial. They would be expected to be on 2 forms of contraception during the course of the trial and for a period, a recommended period thereafter. But childbearing potential per se would not exclude patients from a trial.
You mentioned remission. Mm-hmm. Does that happen?
Yeah.
And for how long?
Right. So this is a disease that we don't typically use the word cure, but we use the word remission. We use the words or the adjectives short-term, long-term remission, sustained remission. Yes. So the goal of therapy in this disease, when I describe to my patients that have sort of earlier stage disease, so patches and plaques, 1A, 1B disease, the goal is to clear the canvas, to not see the disease, because we know that once we're no longer seeing the patches and plaques, that disease isn't going to mysteriously appear in a lymph node or appear in the blood. If we're looking at a bad skin burden, just really tough to clear disease, then we begin to worry about whether or not the disease is going to decide to sort of misbehave. So the goals of for skin-directed therapy with phototherapy, topical steroids, topical nitrogen mustard, is to get rid of everything we can see. Eliminate the patches, eliminate the plaques, and if that patient's itchy, to reduce their itching or eliminate their itching. When they do that, when they achieve that, we refer to it as remission. So if we can't see it, they're in remission. And we obviously continue to follow patients because we want to make sure that it's a sustained remission. So there are partial remissions. So you might have come in and you were really loaded and you're left with a couple sort of patches and plaques. It might be a partial remission, but we absolutely use that word remission. The other thing that's kind of interesting with this disease is when you looked at Dr. Pinter-Brown's slide with all those systemic treatments, we may have patients that come on our doorstep that have, at the get-go, fairly aggressive disease. They may come in with tumors, or they may come in with blood disease, or maybe lymph node disease, and then you expose them to treatment. So you wouldn't start over on the right-hand side and give them topical steroids because their target for their disease is not really their skin. It's where the cells have left the skin and found other areas of interest, i.e. the blood or lymph nodes. You expose them to the systemic treatments, you get what's called a remission. So how do we know that they're in remission? We recheck the blood if that's where their disease was residing, or we'll recheck their PET scans over time if it was because their lymph nodes were involved. If it's their skin, we obviously reassess the skin. Patients can get better after systemic treatment, and then they move to the right-hand slide, and they can be treated like a skin-directed patient again if they have some residual patches or plaques with topical steroids or phototherapy. So this is unlike other cancers. You might present with later stage, like stage 2 or 3 disease, but 10 years from now, your disease is behaving like stage 1 disease because it's been debulked or improved because of therapies that are out there for patients. So we do use the word remission. We don't use the word cure, although I have patients I've taken care of for 14 years that we're still saying hi once a year and fortunately not looking at anything on their canvas. So.